Hello, welcome back to another episode of Across the River and Into the Books with me, Brendan Booth Jones. So I'm on a little adventure this morning. I am going to meet this bookseller that I found online who has got a little run of the Penguin First 1000 series. So I'm kind of a bit nervous. They were a bit reticent in the messages, not seeming super enthusiastic, and I'm hoping to maybe strike up a bit of a deal and take more than one or two and just take, I don't know, I don't really want to spend more than 50 euros. So yeah, it's about a half an hour drive from here. So yeah, let's go and see if we can find a little stash of books for the series. Okay, well, we have got some good stuff. Let's have a little look. It was a successful trip. So look at that. It's got a whole bunch of crime novels from the first 1000. In the Greene, a whole bunch of crime, and then some literary fiction. Yeah, I'm very excited to get into this stuff, and I will get to reading it, and in the meantime I will talk about another 10 books from my collection. This video is going to be a bit different in the sense that this week is just one of those weeks where it's very busy and I need to be in quite a few different places at different times, and so I'm actually filming this in bits and pieces. I tend to normally film everything in one shot and then edit it immediately, but this week it'll be different. So yeah, but let's get into it. The first book that I'm going to discuss in today's video is number 1, Ariel by Maurois. Now, this book in the actual Penguin first edition is very rare, of course. It's from 1935, it was published in July, though the title itself was first published in 1924. Ariel is a biography of Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Romantic poet of the early 19th century. What a engrossing, thrilling and flawed biography this is. A very fascinating choice by Alan Lane, who started this line of penguins. It is fascinating because it is told in a very vivid narrative atmosphere of complete immersion in the story, in the characters' minds, even in their minds. It's very clear from the outset that Maurois takes a lot of poetic license, and I will get this criticism out of the way early so that we can just talk about the pleasure of this work of biography, and that is that Maurois clearly did a huge amount of research. He knew his subject very well. He quotes extensively from letters and diaries. Now, it doesn't seem like Shelley actually wrote diaries himself. And when you learn about his personality, it's not that surprising. He was just too chaotic and too kind of caught up in his ethereal, poetic imaginings to sit down and describe what he had for breakfast. So we don't have Shelley's diaries, it seems, but we have plenty of extracts from Mary Shelley's diaries. So that was, of course, the famous Mary Shelley of Frankenstein, who was Percy Shelley's second wife. And we have a lot of quotation from letters of various characters around Shelley, including his own letters. But my criticism is that there is no preface or introduction or scholarly notes in which Maurois lays out his biographical method. How much poetic license did he take? Because throughout this narrative, and it is really a narrative, there is a lot of quotation that is not attributed, including like the thoughts of characters and private conversations. So for instance, at one point when the Shelleys are in Italy with Lord Byron, Byron and Shelley take a boat ride out to this kind of deserted little island off the coast of Venice, and it's just the two of them, and they kind of wander around. Byron, being typical Lord Byron, has like a stable of horses there somehow, and then they depart this island and they pass another small little patch of land in the bay which has a kind of semi-ruined church tower on it, and the bell tolls in the sunset light. It's very evocative and lyrical, and Byron tells Shelley that this is the madhouse. Now, this whole episode, there was only the two of them there, and yet we are given their intimate one-on-one conversation, and we're also given their kind of very fine, insensitive shifts of feeling and perception and mood and sentiment, and that's just one episode of many. So the reader is often asking themselves, where is he getting this from? And it's quite clear that he has taken poetic license. Now, if he only laid that out explicitly, you could just kind of sit back and enjoy it. And I would advise that if you do manage to read this book, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in the Romantics, if you're interested in Percy Shelley, just if you like a good kind of fictionalized biography or a kind of blend of historical fiction and biography, highly recommend it. And but that line between taking license with history and being kind of having a kind of scholarly discipline and commitment to the facts and the truth, yeah, that boundary is really blurred in Ariel. So the other criticism that I have of this work is that, of course, Mary Shelley wrote this magnificent novel, Frankenstein, as well as other works, but we remember her most for Frankenstein. And I think the story of her and Shelley's relationship and the tragedy involving their children, I think retrospectively one looks back at Frankenstein and sees just this deep, deep ache and hurt in even more sharp clarity, and you feel the agony. Graham Greene writes, and I paraphrase here, that no individual escapes life without a private agony. And I think that the story of Shelley and Mary Shelley allows one to glimpse the astounding horror and personal agony, private agony, that Mary Shelley felt and experienced, and then fed into this throbbing, painful work, Frankenstein. But even though we get that retrospective kind of modulation of Frankenstein, still Maurois does not even mention Frankenstein. Now, I know that it was really in the 20th century that this novel was really revived and lauded and given new critical praise and scholarly focus and theoretical attention. But still, I mean, the fact that he didn't even mention it, and this is he wrote this book in the sort of in the 1920s. So that for me is a flaw, and I would extend that to say that his attitude towards women in general is outdated, and that's being kind, that's being quite generous. He has these really irritating moments where he sort of postulates on, women in this generalized and stereotyped sense, beautiful women, always keep a man guessing, or something like that, where you think, well, this is Maurois bringing in his own bitterness or something. So now, leaving aside the criticisms of it, what makes it so enthralling and invigorating? Well, Shelley's life is absolutely a rich font of biographical tidbits. He was born to a baron. His grandfather was a baron in Sussex, so landed gentry, intergenerational wealth, and like most aristocratic boys, he was sent to Eton, and that's actually where Ariel, the book, opens, is with the kind of philosophy of Eton in that period, which was about severe discipline and conformity, and don't stand out from the crowd. It was all about conservatism and basically producing the next generation of landowners and parliamentarians. And Shelley just did not fit in at all. He was, from the beginning, very strong-willed and eccentric, and his idiosyncrasies were painfully on show in this environment. And he was bullied severely for it. He was quite effeminate. He had this sort of milky skin and these soft curly locks, and these dark eyes and long lashes, and quite a high-pitched voice. He was bullied, and this was our first glimpse into him kind of escaping the suffering of life, and of his life in particular, and retreating into a world of fantasy and imagination. He then left Eton and went to Oxford, and he thought that finally he would be happy here. His father, Timothy Shelley, was a bit of a Philistine, at least that's the way that Maurois portrays him, and he was a member of Parliament, so he was really a part of the establishment, Timothy Shelley. So off goes young Percy to Oxford, and he was very happy at first. He thought, I'm away from these horrible bullies at Eton, and I can have the time and freedom to pursue this kind of ascetic scholarly life. And he was writing furiously already at that stage, and he wrote a book, sort of a kind of polemic in praise of atheism. Now this was the early 1800s, and it was a very, very dogmatic time in terms of the religion across England, and so this was very much looked down upon. Shelley was, as they say, sent down from Oxford. He was expelled. Shelley's father, Timothy, was furious. He wanted his son to, do go from Eton to, Oxford, and then, follow in this aristocratic path into either the clergy or Parliament or something like that. But now he had disgraced his father, and Timothy Shelley was extremely angry about that, and actually this was the first serious rupture in their relationship, and that goes on to really be a theme of Shelley's life story. So his father said, I'm cutting off your allowance until you, sort yourself out and grow up and come back into the fold. But of course Shelley was adamant that he was not going to do that, so they went off to London. But yeah, I'm not going to narrate the whole story, but a lot of things happen. But eventually he meets Mary Shelley, but he's married to Harriet Westbrook, and him and Mary Shelley elope and run off to Europe, and pretty much from then on his life was extremely chaotic. They were, and I will say in terms of Maurois' attitude towards women, he does give us this image of Mary Shelley as a very intelligent and brilliant young woman. It's just a pity that he stops there, because in the end, our image of her through Maurois is of a kind of struggling housewife, and that's not to say that there wasn't some truth in that. I mean, she was the more responsible of the couple, and Shelley eventually managed to make a deal with his father to get access to some of these extraordinary funds, from his grandfather, and so they were at some point kind of elevated out of money struggles, which had lasted quite a few years. But even still, Shelley was so kind of daydreamy and idealistic and also generous and big-hearted. He wanted to help everyone out. But people, of course, took advantage of that, and he didn't want to think pragmatically or plan ahead. And so Mary Shelley, even though she was such a brilliant and creative individual herself, ended up managing the children, managing the household, reminding Shelley to collect their allowance, reminding him to pay bills, and they moved around so much, so much. The most interesting part of this story is really their time in Italy, and they developed quite a close friendship with Lord Byron, who figures prominently in the book Ariel. By the way, the title Ariel is this kind of nickname for Percy Shelley himself. It's a reference to these kind of mystical flights of fancy, and he was Ariel. He is the embodiment of his imagination. Now it's well known how Shelley died. He drowned in a boating accident, and that's not a spoiler, because that's just, if you know anything about Romanticism, you know that is what happened to Percy Shelley, but still, it doesn't ruin the story in any way. And Maurois, he's got quite a literary skill. I mean, he was a novelist himself, and you see that he has these motifs, these kind of leitmotifs, these recurring scenes in various forms in which Shelley is on a boat, he's at sea, he's in the water, he couldn't swim, and he is always there's always this threat of storm or drowning or some kind of foreboding violence, storm clouds, so that is quite well done, I found in the text, and of course building up to this tragedy. There's a lot more tragedy throughout the book. That is Ariel, Andre Maurois. It's a very interesting choice by Alan Lane, and I actually, like I said, it's a very rare edition, so I actually read this book from start to finish on my phone, which I've never actually done before. I've read on e-readers, Kindles and that sort of thing, but I've never actually read a book entirely on my phone, and I kind of had this feeling like, oh, I'm scrolling on my phone reading a book. It wasn't ideal, but I'm very glad that I decided to read it. I found it on the project on Project Gutenberg, which, thanks to some of my viewers of the first episode for pointing that out to me. Yeah, so it was strange reading it on my phone, but I'm ultimately very glad to have read Ariel by Andre Maurois. Perhaps one day, if I find a copy of it, I will, it'll end up in one of my bookshelf tours, and I can talk about some of the many elements that I'm skipping over here. But we've still got to get through 9 other books in the first 1000 series, so let's move on to the next one. So, like I said, my filming this week is a little bit more scattered than it normally is, and here I am on another day, and I'm hoping to now go through the rest of these books from the first 1000 that I want to discuss with you today. Okay, so let's get straight into it. Next up is A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. This is number 2 on the first 1000 list, and yeah, this is a good gateway into Hemingway. I read this book for the first time in 2015, and it was my first Hemingway that I read, and it is a very lucid and gritty tale of love in the face of violence and war. But it's also it's a tragedy. So you get a real sense in this book. Well, let me just give you a bit of a synopsis. It is strikingly autobiographical. Hemingway, as a young man, was an ambulance driver in World War I in Italy, and this is a story based on the protagonist is a young American in Italy driving an ambulance, and he is wounded by some shelling, and he ends up in an Italian hospital, and he falls in love with a nurse there. Now, Hemingway himself was wounded in the First World War, and he did spend time recovering in an Italian hospital, and he did also fall in love with a nurse there. It was his first big, passionate romance, and he was devastated upon leaving the hospital and returning to America when he was discharged. They had plans to meet, basically, and she was going to come over to America, but she wrote him a letter and broke it off, saying that she had met somebody else and that she was married to somebody else in Italy, and she wasn't coming anymore, and that very much devastated him. And you can feel that ire and that disillusioned sense of a cruel, hard, violent universe oozing from the pages of this novel. Now, I don't believe that you need to like an author personally to glean something from a work of literature. There's much of Hemingway's personality and his interests and his values are abhorrent to many of us, and myself included. But in spite of that, he's still very worthwhile because he was very groundbreaking in his style. He wanted to strip away all of the flowery, superfluous frills and produce a kind of concentrated, serious, intense, and pure literature. And we can look back on that seriousness in the manifestos and see it as idealistic, but it's still the modernists in all of their guises have very much shaped the modern world, and Hemingway was definitely one of those forerunners to what we think of as contemporary realism. It's very refreshing when you read his work for the first time, because you realize how much extra detail and elaboration and decoration is unnecessary to convey and to evoke feeling. He rewrote the ending of this book more than a dozen times, and I don't want to give away the ending because it is a very crucial and intense sort of thunderbolt at the end. But you really get with Hemingway a kind of high, subtle irony. That, for example, when you have spring rain in Hemingway, it doesn't represent new life per se, but it is a kind of very subtle soupçon of irony, and what you don't find is the spring rain representing new life, but rather representing death, which puts me in mind of Eliot's famous lines from The Wasteland. April is the cruelest month. Let me see if I can actually find it here. Yeah, the opening of The Wasteland. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. And that inversion is present in Hemingway, and I think that Farewell to Arms is suffused with the natural beauty of the Italian landscape and the Mediterranean, you know, the mountains and the rivers and the glittering Mediterranean. But it's presented in a very stark and spare style, and it's also juxtaposed by the horrors of World War I, the violence and the death and the bloodshed. And yeah, I think I will leave it there. I have many more thoughts on Hemingway, but that is number 2, A Farewell to Arms. Next is Agatha Christie, The Murder on the Links. Now this is really like such a different kind of book to what I've just been discussing. This is genre fiction, but I don't mean that in a pejorative or degrading sense at all. I think that any form of creative expression, whether it's the plastic arts or painting or film or digital or literature of any kind or music, whatever it is, the question is not does it fit a kind of particular zeitgeist or taste or trend, but does it take its own terms, its own formal structure, and do justice to that. And this is genre fiction, right? This is a murder mystery. But the question is not comparing it to a Shakespeare play or to The Wasteland, a modernist epic, but on its own terms, does it execute itself well? And I think that it does. There's a real sense of improbability the further along we go. Well, let me just give a little bit of synopsis. It is, as it says on the tin, the murder on the links. So it's a murder that takes place on a golf course, and Poirot, this is Agatha Christie's Belgian detective, this kind of short man with an egg-shaped head and very gorgeous moustache, and he's sort of close to retirement, or maybe he's even, you know, come out of retirement to take on special cases. This is actually only the second Poirot mystery that she wrote, and yeah, it's well executed. It's a fun book, and of course, if you're discussing a murder mystery, you should really be sensitive to not give away the plot in any way. So I'm not going to do that. It's a whodunit. It's definitely got a bit of humor to it as well. And what I will say is that, and the story is possibly apocryphal, but there is a kind of rumor that Alan Lane, who created this first 1000 Penguin series, that he was good friends with Agatha Christie, and he was on his way to see her, took a train or a series of trains from London down towards rural Devon where she lived, and he desperately wanted something to read, and he couldn't find anything. Like, there was no sort of affordable paperbacks and the sort of kind of books that one could just devour on a train. and supposedly that was a bit of a spark of inspiration for this series. Now, actually, this is not number 6 on the list, but it's 6A, and that is because there was another Agatha Christie novel, which was the first, which was Poirot number 1, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, and that was first released in the Penguin 1000, but then later withdrawn for copyright issues, or there was some legal wrangle, and that was later released. The Mysterious Affair at Styles was later released as number 61. Right, so next up is Mulk, Anand, Untouchable. This is number 312. The Penguin First 1000. I've discussed this book in one of my earlier videos, in one of my bookshelf tours, so I won't say too much about it here, other than just the fact that it is a realist fiction, and it's it takes place in one day, and it's a story told through the eyes of an untouchable, so somebody, as the title says, and this is a member of the lowest caste in the Indian class system, who is tragically treated very badly in society, and the untouchables did, and I think the caste system still exists in India, as far as I know, whether officially or unofficially. I know that there has been some progress towards trying to change things, but I'm not an expert on Indian politics, so I won't delve into that. But it was a very real thing, and there is, of course, still a huge amount of poverty and inequality in India today. Yeah, it's a very shocking book, and infuriating, but also illuminating. And the character of Baka, this is the young man who is the protagonist of this novel. Anand does not portray him sentimentally. It's very gritty, but it's also not, he's not just a stereotype. He's a rounded character with his own thoughts and feelings. And that, I think, is the power of literature, to remind us so much of other lives and other experiences, and to deliver a kind of irrefutable empathy. Next up is number 513, D.H. Lawrence's short story collection, The Prussian Officer. Now, I don't actually have a copy of that short story collection, but I have read the stories in it in different places, and quite a few of them are in this edition that I picked up at a charity shop in Lincoln, in England, a few summers ago. And it does not have the titular story, The Prussian Officer, which is a disturbing tale of two men, and a kind of real sensual and nightmarish tension between them, and a kind of will for revenge. And I read it a few years ago, and I just remember these piercing, cold blue eyes of the Prussian officer himself. But other stories in that collection are, some of the other stories in that collection are Daughters of the Vicar, and one of his very famous short stories, Odor of Chrysanthemums. And Lawrence is obviously known for his famous novels, but his short stories some of them are really good, and there's quite a few good ones in this Penguin collection. There are, if you want to get a taste for Lawrence and not, clamber through one of his enormous and at times infuriating novels, then I can definitely recommend having a dip into some of these stories. Next is 616, Oscar Wilde, Picture of Dorian Gray. Well, in episode 1 of the first 1000 Penguins, we discussed 2 Oscar Wilde plays, and yeah, I'm a big fan of Oscar Wilde's writing. This was his one novel, and yeah, it's his most enduring work probably. So this is the story of Dorian Gray, the eponymous Dorian Gray, who is this decadent, wealthy young man, and he's very vain and self-obsessed, and he has this portrait of himself that he really adores because it just captures his youthful beauty. And the other main character of the story is his friend, Lord Henry Wotton, who is a very memorable character in the whole cast of Western literature. He's very philosophical and witty and labyrinthine in his discourse and his rhetoric. Under Henry Wotton's influence, Dorian Gray leads this double life of, this kind of surface of respectability and gentility, but this kind of depraved and debaucherous nightlife. Next up is number 746, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is even more of a work that has become a classic sort of in the last 100 years or so. It didn't actually do so well when it was first published, but it has become one of the most well-read and most well-loved classics today, and for good reason. Interesting to actually sort of, I didn't plan it this way, but to have it in sequence with a picture of Dorian Gray, because it is also about decadence and about this gap between material riches and kind of a lack of morals, or moral bankruptcy, or moral questions, and kind of shadiness, and what darkness there is underneath a bright, glittering, sequined surface of wealth and surfeit. Yeah, Gatsby is this kind of shady character with a murky past, but he also has a magnetism and draws the whole cast of characters around him into his sort of chandelier sparkling, champagne popping, glitzy world. And it's a gorgeous book. It's a book about voice. Nick Carraway is the narrator of this book, and he is just such a good, understated voice that really sort of amplifies and augments this bright, lavish world of Gatsby through this kind of quite humble and meek narrator, which I think is a very brilliant and effective narrative device. Next up is 907, Franz Kafka, The Trial. Whoa, this is really a nightmarish book. Kafka is one of the few writers, and probably Samuel Beckett is the other one, who have the ability to make me feel extremely claustrophobic, nightmarish. There is, of course, this great adjective which has derived from Kafka's work, which is something being Kafkaesque. And The Trial is the story of a man who wakes up one morning in his very humble digs, in his humble shared accommodation or hostel where he lives, and there are these agents in the room with him, and he's basically under arrest, and he goes through this winding, circuitous and labyrinthine and endlessly frustrating bureaucratic entanglement, trying to get to the bottom of like why he's been summoned and like why he is in trouble with the law. This was a theme that, and an atmosphere that Kafka carried into so much of his work. And this edition has a foreword by Max Brod, and Max Brod was Kafka's literary executor and his close friend and editor. And Brod and Kafka, before he died, instructed Brod to burn his manuscripts. And Brod, of course, famously did not do that, and we're very grateful to him for not doing that. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention this little text as a kind of guide or accompanying text to The Trial. This is letter to father in a very beautiful edition from Vitalis. I know I'm supposed to be talking about the Penguin First 1000s, but look at this. Vitalis is, I think, a fairly small publisher. That's actually Kafka's handwriting, and I think that these are actually copies of the original letter to his father. And often this particular text comes in other collections. It's a part of the short story collection of the Metamorphosis and elsewhere. But this is a lovely little standalone, and this is a whole diatribe of Kafka writing to his father. It's devastating, really. And through his eyes, his father was this brutal man. He was like very uncouth and Philistine, and didn't care at all about Kafka's sensitivity and his creative impulses and his desire to be an artist. And I don't want to waffle on too much here, but I'm just going to say that it is an interesting key to understanding the sense of oppressive authority that looms like a dark cloud over Kafka's work, and that father figure kind of extended out into government, and also, of course, Kafka's identity as a Jew, as a German Jew in Prague. That claustrophobia, that sense of on the run and always guilty and always kind of having to look over your shoulder with paranoia. Yeah, that is a part of the tragedy of the Jewish experience in Europe in the 20th century. All right, now, next we have number 960 in the Penguin First 1000s, and that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Yes, this was one of the first books that I loved, and certainly the most serious work of literature that I genuinely was captivated by and entranced in. And it's a story of a woman who falls in love with a wealthy older man, and the struggle to justify and consummate their love in a time where class divisions were so strong and women's rights were so minimal. And it's an infuriating work, but it's also just so brilliantly idiosyncratic in its characterizations. And Jane Eyre herself, the eponymous heroine of the story, is unforgettable character. Right, so I'm going to end off with George Orwell's 1984. This is number 972 on the First 1000, and yeah, it is again really one of the most famous works of literature. It's a dystopian story of a man who is trying to survive in this brutal future Britain in the year 1984, and that's obviously was written in the 1940s, yeah, Orwell. I prefer Orwell's non-fiction to his fiction. We will discuss some more Orwell in this series. His much lesser known novel Burmese Days is also in the Penguin First 1000, and we've already discussed Animal Farm, which was in the first episode of this series. 1984, yeah, like it's rightfully a classic because it's very brave and bold in its assertions and its sense of complicity, no matter what side of the political spectrum you are on or associate yourself with. Like Orwell was hypercritical of like politics and of human failings on the levels of society and governmental power and political allegiance and association and ideology. So it's a timeless book in that sense, that it's always full of warnings and forebodings for the future. But that being said, as a work of literature, I don't think that Orwell's fiction is so electric and fluid. I think it's sometimes quite stilted and a bit wooden at times. But the ending of 1984 is absolutely harrowing, terrifying, and it stays with you forever once you've read that book, and that ending really, really is terrifying. All right, well, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know, if you've read any of these. I would love to hear from you, and look forward to seeing you again next time.